November 18, 1942, over Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the grip of an unnamed Japanese Zero pilot tightened on his control stick. He observed the unusual twin-fuselage American warplanes ascending from Henderson Field. On this particular date, aviators belonging to the 339th Fighter Squadron became the inaugural pilots of the Lightning to engage Japanese aircraft, signifying a momentous occasion that would dismantle Japanese presumptions regarding their dominance in the skies. Twin-engine, twin-tail, accelerating with an unprecedented swiftness, he would later convey to his squadron commander at Rabaul words that exposed the initial fractures in 3 years of Japanese aerial supremacy. Through his canopy, he had just witnessed something that fundamentally contradicted everything Japanese naval aviation doctrine had instilled. American P-38 Lightning fighters, those peculiar aircraft with twin booms that Japanese intelligence had disregarded as ponderous and unwieldy, had ascended from sea level to combat altitude with greater rapidity than his Mitsubishi A6M20 could possibly match. In China, over the Philippines, and above Pearl Harbor, the Zero had reigned supreme. No Allied fighter could contend with its rate of ascent or its agility. Yet here above this island, saturated with conflict, American aviators in their twin-engine fighters were dictating the terms of engagement from altitudes the Zero struggled to reach. The P-38’s from the 339th Fighter Squadron accounted for 3 Japanese aircraft during this initial combat encounter, executing attacks from altitudes that rendered the Zero's legendary turning capability utterly ineffective. The calculations of aerial dominance were being rewritten, not within flight manuals, but in the stark reality of superior altitude performance that would soon obliterate every assumption Japanese pilots harbored about their invincibility, their aircraft, and their adversaries. The confidence of the rising sun had begun to wane long before that November day, though no one within the Imperial Japanese Navy would have conceded it. Since the 7th of December, 1941, Japanese naval aviators had swept across the Pacific with an aura of invincibility. The Mitsubishi A6M0, with its extraordinary range, tight turning radius, and highly trained pilots, had earned a formidable reputation. The Zero's maximum velocity of 332 miles per hour at its optimal altitude appeared impressive, and its capacity to outmaneuver any Allied fighter made it exceptionally deadly in traditional aerial melees. Among the elite aviators was Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai, a recipient of numerous accolades, a veteran of the China campaign, and a survivor of countless skirmishes. By 1942, Sakai had achieved 13 victories in the Borneo campaign alone, prior to his reassignment to Leyte, New Guinea, where he would tally the majority of his eventual 64 claimed victories. His confidence, much like that of his fellow pilots, was absolute. Lieutenant Junichi Sasai, Sakai's direct superior, had addressed his pilots before combat operations. The American fighters observed over the Guadalcanal area are known to originate from aircraft carriers supporting the invasion. They are likely standard American Navy fighters, not Army aircraft. The Japanese pilots anticipated confronting carrier-based F-4F Wildcats, aircraft they had previously overcome. The initial months of 1942 appeared to validate Japanese superiority. Japanese pilots vanquished obsolete Brewster Buffaloes over Singapore, annihilated Curtiss P-40 Warhawks over Java, and easily dispatched British Hurricanes over Burma. The Zero had achieved nearly complete initial supremacy in the Pacific theater. Even when encountering newer Allied fighters, Japanese pilots maintained their psychological advantage through superior training and strategies honed over years of combat in China. However, intelligence reports circulating back to Japanese squadrons in mid-1942 spoke of a new American fighter, something distinct. Twin engines, twin tails, potent armaments concentrated in the nose. The reports were dismissed by most squadron commanders. How could a twin-engine fighter possibly pose a threat to the agile Zero? Japanese naval doctrine, predicated on the concept of the decisive engagement and individual combat prowess, lacked any framework to comprehend what was imminent. The Lightning emerges. The P-38, Lightning was the sole truly successful twin-engine daytime fighter of the war. It was the result of Lockheed's response to a February 1937 U.S. Army Air Corps specification for a long-range interceptor. Designer Clarence Kelly Johnson and his team had engineered something unprecedented. A fighter capable of exceeding 400 miles per hour, ascending to 40,000 feet, and carrying sufficient fuel for missions spanning over 1,000 miles. The P-38's twin Allison V1710 engines, each generating 1,150 horsepower with turbo-supercharging, bestowed upon it performance characteristics that seemed inconceivable to Japanese engineers. While the Zero had been conceived for maximum maneuverability with minimal weight, even lacking armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks in its early iterations, the Lightning embodied an entirely different philosophy: speed, altitude, firepower, and survivability. The inaugural P-38's arrived in the Pacific Theater not with fanfare, but with mechanical deficiencies. When the first P-38's reached Australia, they were found to possess certain design flaws, and their combat debut was postponed. By late 1942, however, these issues were being rectified, and experienced pilots transitioning from P-40 squadrons were being introduced to the new fighter. The 49th Fighter Group remained equipped with P-40s, but would soon transition to the Lightning. These pilots brought with them hard-won experience engaging Japanese fighters. They had learned, often through fatal trial and error, never to engage a Zero in a turning dogfight. The P-38 would equip them with the means to fight on their own terms. First Blood. Over the Solomons. November 18, 1942, marked the Lightning's inaugural major engagement with Japanese fighters when pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron, operating from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, encountered Japanese aircraft while escorting Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bombers. The outcome astonished both sides. Japanese pilots escorting their bombers first identified the unusual twin-boom silhouettes ascending from the south. Their initial reaction was bewilderment. Were these reconnaissance aircraft? Their rate of climb suggested otherwise. By the time they recognized them as fighters, the P-38's had already established a 5,000-foot altitude advantage. The P-38's would patrol above the altitude at which the Zero could effectively operate. Their considerable speed at high altitudes enabled them to maneuver into the most advantageous positions. Then, the formidable aircraft would plunge from the sky to strike the hapless Zero fighters. The mathematics were stark. While the Zero's low-speed maneuverability was legendary, its high-speed maneuverability was, in fact, inferior to the P-38 at altitude. Above 250 miles per hour, the Zero's controls became progressively heavier. Above 300 miles per hour, the aircraft became difficult to maneuver at all. The P-38, with its hydraulically assisted controls in later variants, maintained effectiveness even in high-speed dives approaching 500 miles per hour. The technological chasm. The astonishment for Japanese pilots extended beyond mere performance metrics. The P-38 represented a fundamentally divergent approach to aerial combat that Japanese military culture had not anticipated. The Lightning's armament, 4 50-caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon concentrated in the nose, delivered devastating firepower in a focused stream that obviated the need for the intricate gun convergence calculations required for wing-mounted weapons. The turbo-supercharged engines were equally revolutionary to Japanese understanding. The P-38's turbo-superchargers rendered it one of the earliest Allied fighters capable of performing exceptionally well at high altitudes, while also muffling the exhaust, contributing to the P-38's relatively quiet operation. Japanese pilots frequently failed to detect the P-38's approach until it was too late. The Zero's Nakajima Sake engine, producing 950 horsepower at sea level, experienced a dramatic power loss with altitude. By 20,000 feet, it was generating barely 750 horsepower. The P-38's turbo-supercharged Allisons maintained their power output to considerably higher altitudes, granting them an overwhelming advantage in the vertical dimension of aerial combat. The psychology of technological inferiority. By early 1943, the psychological repercussions on Japanese pilots were becoming apparent in squadron reports and personal correspondence. The mythology surrounding the Zero's invincibility, meticulously cultivated since the aircraft's introduction in China, was unraveling. Japanese pilots spoke of constant apprehension, aware that a P-38 could strike from any direction. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima encountered what would become a renowned double-team maneuver executed by the adversary. Two Wildcats targeted the commander's aircraft. He experienced no difficulty in positioning himself on the tail of an enemy fighter, but never had an opportunity to fire before the Grumman's partner roared at him from the flank. Nakajima was incensed upon his return to Rabaul. He had been compelled to dive and make an escape for safety. This experience against Wildcats was insignificant compared to what the P-38 would introduce. Saburo Sakai himself would later confess that it was no longer feasible for the Zero fighters to successfully engage the P-38's except under the most exceptional circumstances, which unfortunately seldom materialized. This admission from Japan's most celebrated ace carried profound weight within the pilot community. The tactical reality was even more dire than individual combat statistics indicated. The P-38's range permitted it to appear anywhere across the vast Pacific theater. With a range of 1,600 miles, thanks to auxiliary fuel tanks, the Lightning could escort bombers deep into Japanese territory or conduct fighter sweeps far from American bases. Japanese pilots could no longer rely on numerical superiority within their own territory. The Yamamoto mission, the ultimate demonstration. Nothing more dramatically illustrated the P-38's superiority than Operation Vengeance on April 18, 1943, when 16 P-38's undertook a 435-mile interception mission to eliminate Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The mission demanded precise navigation over water, extended range, and the capability to successfully engage both bombers and their fighter escorts. Major John Mitchell led the mission, with the aircraft flying at 50 feet above the ocean to evade radar detection, subsequently ascending rapidly to intercept altitude. The psychological impact on Japanese naval aviation was devastating. Their most revered leader, traveling with 6 Zero escorts, had been pursued and eliminated by American fighters operating at the extreme limits of their operational range. Zero pilot Kenji Yanaga, who was part of Yamamoto's fighter escort, witnessed the attack. His testimony revealed the shock of the Japanese pilots at the P-38's capabilities. The Lightning pilots had materialized from obscurity, executed their attack with precision, and departed before the Zero escorts could effectively respond. The American pilots had meticulously calculated the interception to the minute, arriving precisely when Yamamoto's flight was most vulnerable, descending for landing. This level of operational planning, coupled with the P-38's performance, represented capabilities that Japan simply could not replicate. Tactical evolution and adaptation. As 1943 progressed, American pilots refined their strategies to maximize the P-38's advantages. The boom and zoom tactic, involving a dive from altitude, firing, and then climbing away before the adversary could react, became standard procedure. Japanese pilots found themselves defenseless against these tactics. The initial air-to-air engagement between the Japanese and the P-38 resulted in 15 Japanese aircraft being shot down for the loss of only one P-38. These lopsided victories became increasingly common as American pilots gained proficiency with their new aircraft. The Japanese attempted various countermeasures. They employed dive breaks to induce overshooting attacks. They attempted to lure P-38's into low-altitude turning engagements. They even developed new, looser formations to better detect incoming assaults. Nothing proved consistently effective. The performance disparity was simply too substantial. The industrial reality behind the performance. The P-38's superiority reflected a more profound truth about American industrial capacity that Japanese pilots were only beginning to comprehend. By the war's conclusion, over 10,000 P-38's would be manufactured, with 18 distinct models representing continuous enhancement. Each new iteration addressed weaknesses and amplified strengths based on combat experiences. The P-38J model, introduced in late 1943, incorporated hydraulically assisted ailerons to improve roll rate, resolved cockpit heating issues that had plagued earlier models in Europe, and featured upgraded turbo-superchargers for even superior altitude performance. Japanese aircraft development, conversely, struggled to achieve incremental improvements to the Zero design. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical architect behind the Pearl Harbor attack, privately admitted to colleagues in mid-1943, "We are not merely confronting a superior fighter, we are facing a system of continuous improvement that we cannot match. Each new American fighter we encounter is superior to the last." The diverging pilot experience. The technological gap was exacerbated by a divergence in pilot quality. By mid-1943, Japan was losing its experienced pilots at a rate faster than they could be replaced. The grim realities of Japan's inability to adequately compensate for war losses in materiel and skill were becoming evident. Training programs were shortened from 2 years to less than 6 months. New pilots arrived at combat units with fewer than 200 hours of flight time. American pilots, conversely, arrived with 400 to 600 hours of training. They had practiced combat maneuvers in advanced training units, studied gun camera footage from actual engagements, and trained on multiple aircraft types. Upon transitioning to P-38’s, they received specialized instruction in twin-engine operations and high-altitude combat tactics. Mechanical complexity and reliability. The P-38’s twin-engine configuration offered an additional advantage that Japanese pilots had not fully appreciated: survivability. With 2 engines, even severely damaged Lightnings could limp home on a single propeller. The psychological impact of this reliability was profound. Japanese pilots flying single-engine aircraft over vast expanses of ocean faced certain death if their engines failed. The Zero's exceptional range came at the expense of minimal armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. A single bullet striking the wrong location meant a fiery demise or a prolonged swim in shark-infested waters. The Intelligence War. By late 1943, Japanese intelligence cautioned pilots to avoid direct engagements with the Lightning, noting its terrifying diving speed, accuracy, and unpredictable appearance. These intelligence reports circulating among Japanese squadrons indicated a growing awareness of their disadvantage. One captured Japanese document from December 1943 stated, "The P-38 type fighter must be considered the most formidable American aircraft in the Pacific. Its speed and climb rate surpass anything we can achieve. Engagement should be avoided unless possessing overwhelming numerical superiority and an advantageous position." This acknowledgement that Japanese pilots should eschew combat with American fighters represented a complete reversal of the warrior ethos that had defined Japanese naval aviation. The psychological impact was devastating. Pilots who had been trained to seek combat at every opportunity were now being instructed to evade the enemy. The aces tell the tale. The emergence of American P-38 aces provided stark evidence of the fighter's superiority. Major Richard Bong became America's highest-scoring ace with 40 victories, all achieved in P-38’s. Major Thomas B. Maguire achieved 38 victories before being tragically killed in January 1945. These scores, accomplished in less than 2 years of combat, surpassed what most Japanese aces had achieved over 3 or 4 years of war. Over 1,800 Japanese aircraft would fall to P-38’s in the Pacific Theater. This tally represented not only aircraft destroyed, but also experienced pilots lost. Pilots Japan could never replace. Each victory diminished Japanese air power exponentially as training programs struggled to produce even minimally competent replacements. Continued technical innovation. As 1944 progressed, the P-38 continued to evolve while Japanese aircraft development stagnated. The P-38L model featured upgraded engines producing even more power at altitude, improved cooling systems, and rocket launchers for ground attack missions. These aircraft could carry substantial bomb loads in addition to their standard armament. Japanese pilots observing P-38's transitioning from air superiority missions to devastating ground assaults realized they were confronting not merely a superior fighter, but a weapon system of unprecedented versatility. The cultural shock. Beyond the technological superiority, Japanese pilots struggled to comprehend the American approach to aerial combat. The Japanese had elevated aerial combat to an art form, emphasizing individual skill and warrior spirit. The Americans treated it as an engineering challenge to be resolved with superior technology and tactics. Commander Masatake Okumiya, a staff officer who analyzed combat reports, wrote, "After the war, we could not accept that fighting spirit alone was insufficient. Every report of P-38's superiority was met with demands for greater dedication, more aggressive spirit. We confused courage with capability. This cultural blindness impeded effective adaptation. While American pilots continuously refined tactics based on combat experience, Japanese training persisted in emphasizing aerobatic skill and individual combat prowess, skills rendered useless against an adversary that refused to engage on those terms. The radar revolution. By mid-1944, some P-38's were equipped with rudimentary airborne radar for night fighting operations. This technology was entirely beyond Japan's capacity to match or counter. Darkness had previously served as a sanctuary for Japanese operations. Now, even night offered no protection. The Marianas Turkey Shoot. While the P-38 did not directly participate in the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, its impact was felt in the caliber of Japanese pilots who faced the U.S. Navy's Hellcats. Years of attrition against P-38's and other American fighters had decimated Japan's experienced aviators. The Marianas Turkey Shoot, where American pilots shot down over 300 Japanese aircraft with minimal losses, represented the culmination of a process that the P-38 had accelerated. Vice Admiral Takeo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese carrier forces, later admitted, "Our pilots were not prepared. They possessed neither the experience nor the aircraft to contend with the Americans." The war in the air had been lost long before that day. Desperation and innovation. As 1944 transitioned into 1945, Japanese attempts to counter the P-38 became increasingly desperate. They experimented with ramming attacks, recognizing the futility of conventional combat. They developed phosphorus anti-aircraft shells specifically to target the P-38's fuel tanks. They even endeavored to develop their own twin-engine fighters, though none achieved operational status in significant numbers. The Kawasaki Ki-102, Japan's attempt at a twin-engine fighter comparable to the P-38, demonstrated the technological disparity. While the P-38 had been operational since 1941, the Ki-102 did not enter service until 1945, and only 238 were produced. It was slower than the P-38, climbed poorly, and suffered from chronic engine issues. The end of air superiority. By early 1945, Japanese pilots no longer spoke of air superiority or even parity. They spoke of survival. The P-38, alongside other American fighters, had established complete dominance over Japanese airspace. Saburo Sakai himself would later declare that the P-38 had shattered the morale of the Zero fighter pilot. The numbers tell the story. The statistics from P-38 operations in the Pacific narrate a tale of overwhelming victory. Over 1,800 Japanese aircraft destroyed by P-38's. Major Richard Bong, 40 victories, all achieved in P-38's. Major Thomas Maguire, a distinguished aviator, recorded 38 aerial victories. Pilots flying the P-38 Lightning claimed more Japanese aircraft destroyed than any other fighter in the Army Air Forces. In stark contrast to these successes, the escalating losses experienced by the Japanese military painted a much bleaker picture. By the cessation of hostilities, Japan had lost more than 90% of its experienced airmen who had been active at the commencement of the war. The average Japanese aviator in 1945 possessed less than 100 hours of cumulative flight experience. These were not seasoned combatants, but rather individuals relegated to the role of sacrificial offerings, dispatched against an adversary with whom they held no prospect of victory. Post-war investigations subsequently shed light on these matters. Following Japan's capitulation, American occupation forces undertook extensive debriefings with surviving Japanese aviators and their commanding officers. These interrogations comprehensively illuminated the profound psychological toll exacted by the P-38. Commander Masatake Okumiya candidly conceded, "The P-38 completely shattered our confidence. We had harbored a firm belief in our inherent superiority, in our aircraft, and in our training." The lightning unequivocally demonstrated the fallacy of all these convictions. It wasn't merely a matter of superior speed or armament. It represented an entirely different paradigm of warfare, one to which we were wholly unequipped to respond. One Japanese pilot, interviewed after the conflict, expressed his astonishment. "During my initial encounter with the P-38, I was taken aback to discover an American aircraft capable of outrunning, outclimbing, and outdiving the Zero, an aircraft we considered the pinnacle of fighter design in the world." A comprehensive technical examination conducted in the post-war era further substantiated the magnitude of the performance disparity. The Mitsubishi A6M20 exhibited a maximum velocity of 332 miles per hour at its optimal altitude, with a service ceiling of 33,000 feet, though it struggled significantly above 25,000 feet. Its rate of climb was 3,100 feet per minute, diminishing considerably with altitude. The aircraft's operational range was 1,930 miles, which was indeed exceptional for its era. Its armament comprised two 7.7mm machine guns and two 20mm cannons, but with limited ammunition. Early models lacked any form of armor protection. Similarly, self-sealing fuel tanks were absent in the initial variants. In comparison, the Lockheed P-38L Lightning boasted a maximum speed exceeding 400 miles per hour. Its service ceiling reached 44,000 feet, and its climb rate was 4,750 feet per minute at sea level. With the addition of drop tanks, its range extended to 1,600 miles. Its armament consisted of four 50-caliber machine guns and two 20mm cannons, complemented by extensive armor plating for pilot protection and standard self-sealing fuel tanks. These figures unequivocally demonstrated a complete mismatch in capabilities. The Zero had been conceived for a different type of warfare, one where individual aerial prowess and maneuverability were the deciding factors. The P-38, conversely, epitomized industrial-age warfare, where technological advancement, production capacity, and systematic enhancements dictated outcomes. The P-38's inherent superiority was a direct reflection of America's formidable industrial strength, which dwarfed Japan's manufacturing capabilities. Lockheed produced in excess of 10,000 P-38's throughout the duration of the war. Japan, in total, manufactured approximately 10,000 Zeros, but this production was spread over a considerably longer period, and the quality progressively declined as the war progressed. American manufacturing methodologies, perfected through assembly line techniques adapted from the automotive industry, enabled the rapid production of P-38's at a rate that surpassed Japan's capacity to train pilots. Each P-38 was assembled from thousands of meticulously crafted components, manufactured to exacting tolerances, a testament to American industrial coordination that Japan was unable to replicate. The Allison engines powering the P-38 were paragons of engineering achievement, incorporating sophisticated supercharging technology, precision manufacturing, and metallurgical expertise that lay beyond Japan's industrial reach. While Japanese engines necessitated extensive manual adjustments and fitting, American engines were essentially interchangeable, significantly simplifying maintenance and enhancing overall reliability. By 1944, the disparity in pilot training had evolved into a gaping chasm. American P-38 pilots underwent specialized twin-engine training, including over 100 hours on twin-engine trainers before even transitioning to the P-38. This rigorous curriculum encompassed engine-out procedures, asymmetric thrust management, high-altitude physiology and oxygen system utilization, gunnery practice employing camera guns and towed targets, formation tactics and mutual support protocols, escape and evasion techniques, and a comprehensive understanding of aircraft systems. Japanese pilot training by 1944 consisted of rudimentary flight instruction, typically ranging from 50 to 100 hours, minimal engagement with combat tactics, limited opportunities for gunnery practice due to ammunition scarcity, no specialized training for high-altitude operations, and an overriding emphasis on spiritual resolve over tactical doctrine, often culminating in preparation for kamikaze missions. The inevitable outcome was predictable. American pilots entered combat theaters as highly skilled professionals, while Japanese pilots arrived as scarcely competent individuals destined for sacrifice. The P-38 fundamentally reshaped aerial combat tactics. The conventional turning dogfight, which had been the dominant engagement method since the First World War, became utterly obsolete. While the P-38 could not outmaneuver the A6M0 in a turning fight at speeds below 200 miles per hour, its superior velocity, combined with its excellent rate of climb, enabled the effective employment of energy tactics. American pilots developed the high-side pass maneuver, approaching from above and behind, diving through the enemy formation with guns blazing, and then rapidly ascending to altitude before the adversary could react. This tactic, rendered feasible only by the P-38's exceptional performance characteristics, rendered Japanese defensive formations ineffective. The Japanese attempted to adapt by deploying fighters at multiple altitudes, but this strategy only served to disperse their forces and cripple their ability to coordinate effectively. They also tried to exploit cloud cover for concealment, but the P-38's speed allowed it to rapidly cover vast areas, locating Japanese aircraft regardless of their hiding places. The distinct visual profile of the P-38 evolved into a potent psychological weapon. Its distinctive twin-boom configuration initially appeared alien to Japanese pilots, who erroneously dismissed it as cumbersome and unwieldy. However, this unique silhouette rapidly transformed into a symbol of American technological supremacy, instilling fear in Japanese aviators even before aerial engagement commenced. Ground crews reported that the mere mention of P-38's in the vicinity would prompt Japanese pilots to postpone missions or demand additional fighter escorts. The aircraft's informal designation among Japanese pilots, 2 planes, 1 pilot, reflected both their initial bewilderment regarding its design and their grudging respect for its capabilities. The P-38's qualitative advantage carried significant strategic implications that extended beyond tactical air engagements. Japanese military planning had predicated their strategy on achieving rough parity in the air, believing their superior warrior spirit would ultimately prevail. The P-38 unequivocally demonstrated that technological superiority could create such an overwhelming advantage that spiritual fortitude became irrelevant. This realization profoundly influenced Japanese strategic decisions, including the accelerated development of kamikaze tactics as conventional air combat became increasingly hopeless, the recall of remaining experienced pilots to bolster home island defenses, the abandonment of offensive air operations by mid-1944, the diversion of resources toward desperate wonder weapon projects, and a stark recognition that the war was unwinnable through conventional means. Admiral Somu Toyota, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, privately acknowledged in October 1944, "We no longer possess an air force capable of conventional operations. The American fighters, particularly the P-38, have effectively eliminated our capacity to contest air superiority." The P-38's twin-engine configuration initially raised concerns among American planners regarding maintenance complexity, but this aspect ultimately underscored another significant American advantage: sophisticated maintenance and logistical capabilities. P-38 squadrons consistently maintained operational readiness rates exceeding 80%, even within the challenging conditions of the Pacific Theater. Japanese units operating simpler single-engine fighters struggled to achieve even 50% availability by 1944. American maintenance crews, many drawn from civilian aviation and automotive sectors, implemented systematic approaches to aircraft upkeep. They developed specialized tools, standardized procedures, and rigorous preventive maintenance schedules. Japanese maintenance practices remained largely traditional, relying on individual skill rather than systematic protocols. P-38's equipped with radio direction finding equipment were capable of precise navigation over vast Pacific distances. They could home in on radio beacons, locate their bases in adverse weather conditions, and execute attacks with remarkable temporal accuracy. Japanese pilots, conversely, primarily relied on dead reckoning and visual navigation, which inherently limited their operational flexibility. This navigational advantage proved critical during extended range missions. The pivotal interception mission targeting Admiral Yamamoto, for instance, demanded incredibly precise navigation across 435 miles of open ocean, requiring arrival at a specific location at a predetermined time. Japanese pilots would have been incapable of executing such a mission with their available navigational technology. The Imperial Japanese Navy had meticulously constructed its entire strategic doctrine around naval aviation. The P-38's overwhelming dominance effectively dismantled this foundational pillar. Carrier air groups, painstakingly rebuilt after the losses sustained at Midway, were systematically decimated by P-38's and other American fighters during the island-hopping campaigns. By 1944, Japanese carriers embarked with air groups at half strength, comprised of inadequately trained pilots. Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa, commanding the first mobile fleet, reported prior to the Battle of the Philippine Sea, "Our pilots are not prepared for combat against American fighters. They can barely manage carrier landings, let alone engage P-38's and Hellcats. We are essentially dispatching them to certain annihilation." The encounter with the P-38 necessitated a profound transformation in Japanese military thinking. The Bushido Code, which emphasized spiritual fortitude and individual warrior valor, proved woefully inadequate against the onslaught of American industrial warfare. Younger Japanese officers began to critically question the very foundations of their nation's military doctrine. This cultural shift extended beyond the military sphere. Japanese pilots who managed to survive combat and return, a rare occurrence, brought back accounts of American technological superiority that directly contradicted years of propaganda, portraying Western decadence and Japanese spiritual invincibility. The P-38 program represented a substantial economic undertaking that Japan could not match. Each P-38 incurred an approximate cost of $97,000 in 1944. While a considerable sum, America manufactured them in the thousands. Japan, meanwhile, struggled to produce aircraft costing a fraction of that amount in any meaningful quantity. The aluminum required for a single P-38 often exceeded the monthly allocation for many Japanese aircraft factories by 1944. The sophisticated precision instruments, the turbo-superchargers, the constant speed propellers, each component signified industrial capabilities that Japan had simply never developed. The most compelling evidence of the P-38's impact stems from the testimonies of Japanese pilots themselves. These men, rigorously trained never to admit weakness, universally acknowledged the lightning's superiority in post-war interviews. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai recounted, "The P-38 would patrol at altitudes beyond the operational ceiling of the Zero. Their exceptional speed at higher altitudes enabled them to maneuver into the most advantageous positions. Subsequently, these formidable aircraft would descend from the heavens to overwhelm the hapless Zero fighters." Perhaps the most profound humiliation stemmed not from direct combat losses, but from the P-38's other remarkable capabilities. P-38 reconnaissance variants were responsible for capturing approximately 90% of the aerial photographic intelligence gathered in the Pacific Theater. Japanese positions, troop movements, and defensive preparations were under constant surveillance. The very aircraft that dominated them in combat was meticulously mapping their impending defeat. Japanese commanders came to realize that their every action was observed, photographed, and analyzed. The P-38 F-5 photo reconnaissance variant, stripped of its weaponry but retaining its full performance envelope, could photograph Japanese installations with impunity. Japanese fighters dispatched to intercept these reconnaissance missions simply lacked the altitude to engage them. The profound shock experienced by Japanese pilots upon encountering the P-38 resonated far beyond the duration of the war. It significantly influenced subsequent Japanese aviation development, military doctrine, and even cultural perspectives regarding the interplay of technology and tradition. Many surviving Japanese pilots became staunch advocates for technological advancement in post-war Japan. They had personally learned that courage, devoid of capability, was ultimately meaningless. Their experiences played a crucial role in Japan's post-war embrace of technology and industrial progress. Saburo Sakai, who later achieved success as a businessman, frequently spoke of the invaluable lessons learned from confronting the P-38. "The lightning taught us," he stated, "that we must never again allow ourselves to fall behind technologically. It demonstrated to us that industrial might, not warrior spirit, ultimately determines victory in modern warfare." The P-38's evolution throughout the war highlighted America's advantage in rapid technological innovation. Challenges identified during combat engagements were swiftly addressed in subsequent production models. Issues related to compressibility in dives led to the incorporation of dive flaps. Cold cockpit conditions prompted the development of improved heating systems. Complaints regarding roll rate were resolved through the implementation of hydraulically boosted ailerons. Japanese aircraft development, constrained by limited resources and institutional rigidity, could not parallel this pace of improvement. The Zero that engaged in combat in 1945 was, in essence, the same aircraft that had attacked Pearl Harbor, with only minor enhancements. In stark contrast, the P-38L of 1945 represented a dramatic improvement over the P-38E of 1942. General Kenny, the commander of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, was quoted as remarking, "The P-38 pilots flying at great height dictated the terms of engagement, choosing when and where they wanted to fight, with disastrous consequences for Japanese pilots." This capacity to unilaterally define engagement parameters constituted a revolutionary shift in air combat that Japanese military doctrine never effectively countered. The statistical evidence is overwhelming. By the war's conclusion, the two foremost American aces had amassed 78 Japanese aircraft kills between them, all achieved while flying P-38's. The top surviving Japanese ace, conversely, had accumulated 64 victories over a span of 6 years of conflict. The sheer mathematics of attrition proved unsustainable for Japan. The P-38's ascendancy over the Zero signified more than mere technological superiority. It underscored fundamental differences in approach to warfare, industrial capacity, innovation, cultural values, and strategic thinking. The Japanese had prepared for a swift, decisive conflict wherein warrior spirit would triumph over material disadvantages. The P-38, however, embodied American preparedness for a protracted industrial war where technology and production capacity would ultimately prove decisive. The psychological shock experienced by Japanese pilots upon encountering the P-38 was, in reality, the shock of confronting modernity itself. The lightning epitomized the systematic application of science, engineering, and industrial management to the conduct of warfare. Against this formidable force, the samurai tradition, however noble in its own right, proved utterly helpless. Beneath the layers of statistics and technical specifications lay a profound human tragedy. Thousands of young Japanese pilots, many possessing less than 100 hours of flight time, were dispatched against P-38's in aircraft that had become obsolete. They understood their hopeless situation. Letters home, discovered after the war, reveal young men resigned to their fate. One poignant message from a young pilot, penned before his final sortie, read, "Mother, I will face the twin-tailed devils tomorrow. I do not anticipate returning. They fly higher and faster than we can comprehend. I will fulfill my duty, but I am aware it is futile." He was subsequently shot down by P-38’s over Rabaul in March 1944. His was one of thousands of similar narratives, tales of young lives tragically sacrificed to a technological disparity that sheer courage could not surmount. The P-38’s influence extended well beyond the conclusion of the Second World War. It significantly impacted the development of Cold War aircraft, with both the United States and the Soviet Union proceeding to develop twin-engine, high-altitude interceptors based on the valuable lessons learned from the Lightning. The principle of leveraging technology to achieve overwhelming advantage became a cornerstone of American military doctrine. For Japan, the experience profoundly shaped its post-war self-defense forces, leading to a prioritization of quality over quantity and advanced technology over mass mobilization. The trauma of technological inferiority left indelible marks on Japanese military thinking. The shock experienced by Japanese pilots when they found themselves unable to outrun or outclimb the P-38 Lightning marked the definitive end of an era in aerial warfare. The age of the individual ace pilot, where personal skill and valor determined victory, perished in the skies over the Pacific. It was supplanted by the realities of industrial-age warfare, where technological innovation and systematic advancements dictated outcomes. Saburo Sakai's post-war reflection, stating that the P-38 had annihilated the morale of the Zero fighter pilot, perfectly encapsulated the essence of this profound transformation. It was not simply a matter of the P-38 possessing superior speed or climb rate. It represented a paradigm of warfare that Japan was fundamentally incapable of matching. The Japanese pilots who survived the conflict learned a harsh and irreversible lesson. In modern warfare, courage without technological prowess translates not to heroism, but to utter futility. The P-38 Lightning did more than simply shoot down Japanese aircraft. It shattered an entire worldview concerning warfare, honor, and national power. Their shock was the shock of discovering that everything they believed about aerial combat was fundamentally flawed. The Zero, which had appeared invincible in 1941, had become obsolete by 1943. The pilots who had dedicated years to training in aerial acrobatics found their skills rendered irrelevant on those terms. Ultimately, the twin-tailed devil that haunted the nightmares of Japanese pilots represented far more than just a superior fighter aircraft. It embodied American industrial might, cutting-edge technological innovation, and a systematic approach to warfare that would come to define the latter half of the 20th century. The final word rightfully belongs to Saburo Sakai, Japan's most celebrated fighter ace, who survived the war and lived to impart its lessons. "The P-38 taught us," he declared, "the hardest lesson of all, that the age of the samurai had ended. In the skies over the Pacific, we encountered the future, and it utterly destroyed us." The shock of that encounter continues to reverberate, a stark reminder that in the crucible of war, technology and industrial capacity ultimately prevail over tradition and individual valor. The Japanese pilots who could neither outrun nor outclimb the P-38 Lightning learned this devastating lesson at the profound cost of their lives, their aircraft, and ultimately their empire's aspirations of dominance. They had challenged the arsenal of democracy with the spirit of the samurai. The P-38 Lightning was democracy's response, delivered with devastating precision from altitudes of 30,000 feet at speeds of 400 miles per hour, a force against which no amount of courage could ultimately prevail.